is based on a few things. I would argue that communities throughout the world have been experimenting with either methods, approaches to prevent or reduce issues around violence, particularly to do with young people. Nationally, internationally, globally, numerous strategies appear promising, but most of the most celebrated models that are often used by professionals are oftentimes led by law enforcement and often rely on the influence of what is known as suppression, deterrence, or both. So this idea that in order to engage with criminal behavior in any Western society, oftentimes has been to lock young people up and throw away the key. And what we have learned is that locking people up doesn't solve the problem. What it does do is remove an individual. Of course, if that individual has caused the problem or done something within the community, but it doesn't get rid of the problem. And oftentimes these enforcement-based violent reduction ideas or approaches oftentimes generate immediate results, as I just said, people being incarcerated, but they require a continued coordination of complex, oftentimes bureaucracy, and especially knowing from the spaces where many of you are from, we know that everything oftentimes is political, things are systemic. So in order to break the chains of the issues that exist amongst children and young people in your settings is very difficult because oftentimes it's tied towards politics. And very much like here in the UK as well, depending on what the political agenda is, oftentimes is what we're going to see in terms of a ripple effect of what happens within our local communities. And oftentimes these models are proven that it doesn't lead to social change, meaning again, when we're talking about locking people up and throwing away the key, it doesn't change society. So this is why we as practitioners, as academics, as those of us that are managers, team leaders, supervisors, those working on the front line with children, young people and their families, it's important that we come together to actually talk about some of the fundamental issues and concerns and the factors in order for us to think about how we can assist young people. So as a visual, what I want everybody to do, if they've got a phone or if they're able to write really fast, is really just kind of look at this model for a second, and I'm going to explain it. So if you've got a mobile phone, you might want to screenshot the image because I'm going to break it down, and then I want you to think about and consider how this may be in terms of your worldview. So one of the things that I look at in terms of a criminological perspective, it's known as the criminal justice pipeline. Some of you may be aware, if you've ever studied sociology within the last 6 to 7 years, it's also known as the school to prison pipeline, but it ultimately follows the same narrative. So the argument begins with that young people, children, live within a society where they feel marginalized. They feel pushed to the society because we as the adults that live within that society do not hear, do not take heed, do not acknowledge the talents and the thought processes of children and young people. So therefore, children and young people create what we know as subgroups in order for them to navigate their way through life. Now, whilst young people are feeling marginalized or alienated, there is a concept called social disorganization, which is the second box. And from a criminological and sociological perspective, all social disorganization means, in layman terms, is that you have institutions, you have entities that govern a society. So you have the police, you have schools, you have healthcare, you have NHS services, mental health services, services that engage with people's health as a whole. You have criminal justice in order to ensure that people's behaviors are monitored as well as punished if somebody does something wrong. And with all of those particular entities that exist within any society and community, they are disorganized on the basis that they do not collaborate, they do not multi-agency work, they do not engage with each other. So if you've got a child or a young person that's going through issues around identity, mental health, domestic violence, domestic abuse, violence that may come from their peers, bullying, peer pressure. If young people are feeling marginalized within a society and they feel that the adults within that society do not hear them, do not see them, and we as adults that work within these institutions, whatever they may be, are disorganized, these children and young people cannot navigate their way in a positive way through that society because we as the adults fail to fulfill those needs. So what happens by default is that these marginalized children and young people walk right past us as adults and they start to join deviant groups. Now, it's not necessarily that young people that join these groups go into these groups to engage in criminal behavior. Oftentimes, these children and young people join these deviant groups because they're looking for a need that has been unfulfilled by the adults in the previous box that I just mentioned. So young people are looking for something, whether that is a sense of belonging, whether they're looking for security, whether they're looking for a friendship group, whether they have dreams and aspirations that have not been met by the adults that live within society. They find new dreams and aspirations in the deviant groups that they attach to. Now, the problem that I have with the idea about deviant groups is, even if you have a young boy or a young girl that starts to engage in that deviant group, deviant ultimately means is that those individuals are possibly involved in some form of criminal activity. And at some point in time, those marginalized children and young people that hang around with individuals that happen to be deviant, that happen to be criminal, at some point in time, they're going to engage in those types of behaviors. So when we look at criminality, criminality can come in all forms, and that may start off very small, stealing, robbery, that then goes on to aspects of violence, selling drugs, extortion, murder, extreme levels of violence, terrorism even. Now, according to the point that I just made in the previous slide about the methods of why things are not changing, is because there's 3 places where children and young people are ultimately sent when we as a society feel that we can't deal with that appropriate issue. So going back to my point again, the easiest thing to do is what? Lock them up and throw away the key. So I argue, if our children don't end up dead as a consequence of violence, as a consequence of being somewhere or being in the wrong place or the wrong time or getting caught up in some sort of conflict, they either end up dead or they end up in a prison, children's secure unit, or by default become mentally ill and have to go away for a period of time whilst they're engaged in mental health services. But this is the problem, because for example, in the UK, we have to pay taxes, and with our taxes, we pay for individuals that may get punished for the crimes that they do, but there's also a level of rehabilitation, meaning individuals are going through a systematic process where they're supposed to change. But unfortunately, when we're talking about overcrowding in prisons, when we're talking about limited resources, when we're talking about lack of funding to engage with children and young people in a holistic way, what happens is at some point in time, they have to be returned back to the community. But guess what? They're still marginalized, and I would argue they're going to be even more marginalized and alienated because they've gone through now a whole cycle where their issue, the root cause of their problem, hasn't been engaged. So whilst they stay marginalized and alienated, we, and I say we as adults within the society, are still disorganized. We have not become organized. So the cycle then begins, because the easiest thing for a child or a young person to do is when they engage with adults that don't understand what's going on in their lives, when they work with adults that cannot give them positive and realistic pathways to stop committing crime, they always return back to their environment. They always return back to the groups and individuals that were involved in criminality in the first place. And then it just becomes a revolving door. So one of the things that we need to think about, and I think this is a wider discussion nationally and internationally, is where do we have the most power in terms of engaging with children and young people? Now, we would argue that these issues are systemic, and I agree. However, based on our knowledge and our skills, we actually have an amazing opportunity to become socially organized. Because when we become socially organized, young people that feel marginalized and alienated for a range of reasons that exist within society, they're able to engage with adults and organizations and institutions that truly understand them. Is that going to solve the whole problem of issues around children and young people? No, it isn't. But as a practitioner, I would like to think if 20 young people entered into my youth center, then at least 10 of them can leave with a realistic pathway that's going to put them on the process and the conveyor belt to stop engaging in criminality. I think I'll sleep better at night knowing that I've saved 10 as opposed to ruining the lives of the whole 20, because I actually don't know what I'm doing, which goes back to my original point when I said setting the scene, because a lot of us want to act, a lot of us want to do, but I argue, do we truly understand the reality of children and young people in 2020 and beyond, with social media, with the challenges of social media, with issues around education, with issues around poverty, and so on and so forth? Because we know that violence is a symptom of a deep-rooted issue. There is not one issue to explain why individuals become violent. And likewise, when we're talking about conflict resolution, or we're talking about an approach to engage with children and young people, we know it cannot be one particular method. Conflict resolution is only one method. Mediation is only one method. But what we learn as youth work practitioners and those that are trained to become youth workers, we're taught to work in a holistic way, a way in which we engage with different people, whether male or female, and regardless of the issues that they come with, we follow what is called a person-centered approach. I'll say that again. We follow a person-centered approach, meaning we see individuals for who they are. So if 5 people come into my building, I do not assume that all 5 have the same likes, the same ideas, the same dislikes. I acknowledge that each and every individual is unique, and my interventions and my strategies and my approaches to engage with those individuals are going to be singular and not plural. So when we talk about violence in a wider context, many of you in this room will agree that these are some of the deep-rooted issues that impact our children and young people, and I would say across our societies ultimately as a whole. The history of systemic violence. These are the things that oftentimes we don't talk about. So we talk about violence in the context of what's happening now, but sometimes we don't talk about the history of violence that exists within many of our societies. Many of our societies have been built on violence. I'll say that again. Many of our societies have been built on violence. So we can't blame young people when there's films, there's games, there's songs, there's expressions that come out in TV, in other forms of social media that are constantly talking about and showing violence, and people consume that violence. And then when young people attach themselves to that violence, we as the adults blame the young people and say they shouldn't like violence. When there's multi-million and billion-pound and dollar industries that benefit from bloodshed, violence, sex, and murder. So when we talk about the issue of violence, we also have to look at the historical nature as it relates to that. We also have to look at the historical nature of interpersonal violence. Now, interpersonal violence is all about peer-to-peer violence. For example, somebody said that I disrespected them. Somebody said they was looking at my woman. Somebody said they was looking at my man. Somebody said someone disrespected me. Somebody said they was looking at me for 5 seconds and I felt disrespected. Somebody stepped on my trainers or my crepe. And on the basis of that, I'm prepared to use extreme violence on that basis. And when I engage with young people that have happened to be involved in gangs, I will ask young people today, why are you involved in this particular gang? And those children and young people can't tell you where the beef and the conflict started. But what they know is we're continuing a cycle of violence on the basis of some older or elder in the community, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that had a dispute with somebody else. And that tit for tat violence has continued even to this day. And that happens across the world when we're talking about young people that engage in issues of violence. So interpersonal violence is very different to systemic violence. And if we want to talk about that a little bit later in the Q&A, I can give you some more examples. I think one of the other things that we don't talk about is poverty. And we know when we're talking about some of the poorest places around the world, lack of resources, a so-called society that we live in the West, but poverty exists. But you have multi-billion-pound industries and companies, yet there's still poverty, yet there's people that are homeless, yet there's people that are starving. And all of these issues, when we talk about wealth and poverty, causes a ripple effect in terms of specific nations being able to fight the social ills, ultimately what they're faced with. The impact of colonialism. We can't have these discussions and talk about the impact of colonialism. And we see the global discussion that's happening right now around institutional racism, around injustice, around inequality. And now we're having individuals having these conversations, which are not new, that people are now acknowledging the system of white supremacy and how that's impacted on societies globally. Lack of opportunities, high unemployment, poor or no education, poor housing conditions for many. Individuals come from dysfunctional families, no resources whatsoever for the youth. So we talk about engaging with the youth, supporting the youth, but where are the resources? For example, here in the UK, about 10 years ago, we had a complete dismantlement of youth services. So whereas you had a period where young people engage in a particular type of way, new government agendas meant that youth work as an art, as a response to engage with social ills for young people, were completely dismantled. And now when we have issues within the UK around gun crime, knife crime, children being exploited either sexually or criminally, we can say, we can look back 12 years ago and say that this was gonna come. And some of the same scenarios that many of you are faced with when we talk about the history, these are the factors that impact and give us a true analysis of why we have the issues faced with us. And I think one of the things that we don't talk about when we talk about the issues of violence amongst children and young people is trauma. And I would extend to talk about intergenerational trauma, that great-great-grandma didn't get to go through a process of healing. Grandma, granddad didn't go through a process of healing. Our parents didn't go through a process of healing. So we have inherited trauma that has come from issues linked to institutional systems, the impact of colonialism, and so on and so forth. And now we're having the ripple effect, and we see all of these things now being played out in all of our countries. Poor healthcare, reactive policies, meaning we have an idea, we have the approach, we have the method, we try it out for a small period of time, and then we change. So when I was working in Jamaica, that was one of the biggest problems that we had. Somebody would come up with a unique idea and approach to engage in violence, and in a moment another political party gets in or a new political idea comes in, we change it and then we go to something else. Complete waste of money, complete waste of resources, complete waste of people's time, and then we're starting again from scratch. Limited police presence within communities. We know that there's damaged relationships between the police and communities, and we know that that happens ultimately as a whole. Poor leadership. Those that we call leaders, are they true leaders? Are they truly leading our communities, or are they just doing things to benefit themselves and their pockets? And these are the conversations that we have. And I know if I was to go through to each and every individual that is within our webinar today, you can add to the list. So this is not the only root causes, but from the literature that we oftentimes read, these are the key things that oftentimes the root cause to the problem. So when we now ascertain and understand the issue of violence that exists within our society, one of the new things that is now being spoken about, which is also not new, is this idea that we have a pandemic of violence. Violence spreads like a disease, and we need to acknowledge the fact that violence is a public health issue. I'll say that again. We need to acknowledge that violence is a public health issue. So if violence is a public health issue, wherever that may be within any society around the world, then the only response should be a public health approach. So the problem that we have in our society is we have issues like gang violence, gun violence that exists within our community. And we think that just by bringing a group of young people into a school and talking to them about the consequences is enough to deal with the problems that have been systemically implemented and programmed into children and young people across the society. So I'll go back to my previous slides. If we understand then that violence is a public health issue, then if our methods and our approaches to engage with children and young people does not seek to impact the things that I've just mentioned there, then we're going to have another 10, 15, 20, 30 years of the same problem. So we need to be radical in our conversations and the way in which we approach these particular issues within our society. And then when we now talk about social media and the role of social media as it impacts children and young people, it makes our work as professionals, as parents, as members of our community, much difficult to engage because everything now exists within a social media realm. So young people are utilizing Instagram, young people are utilizing Snapchat, young people are utilizing YouTube, WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook. Not Facebook so much. I think that Facebook is just more so for us adults, but young people are utilizing social media platforms as ways to communicate. So if young people are utilizing these social media platforms to communicate at a rapid rate, and also to add that COVID-19 has forced us as a society or societies to utilize social media platforms much more, individuals that are involved in criminality are likewise going to utilize social media platforms too. So when we talk about the conversation about exploitation, criminal entities and mindsets acknowledge the social disorganization that we as professionals don't have a hold on the problem. And what they do is utilize these particular platforms to entice, to groom, to inspire, to motivate children and young people that potentially are vulnerable on the basis of the fact that they're young, they're naive, they don't understand ultimately what's going on, and they get exploited in forms of criminal exploitation, meaning they may get asked to sell drugs, they may get asked to hold weapons, they may be asked to be utilized for their bodies in order for sex. And a lot of young people do these things because they're thinking, one, they might make a little bit of money, two, it's going to give me some sort of credibility, three, it's going to make me popular amongst my peers. And all of the list of things that young people will do that for in terms of the pull factors, individuals that are involved in criminal mindsets ultimately will just continue exploiting that. And that's the reason why during COVID-19, as Debbie mentioned in the beginning about that report, it highlighted how many vulnerabilities children and young people had specifically during COVID-19, the rise of those particular vulnerabilities, and how criminal entities were going to exploit that to ensure that young people were involved in criminal behaviors. But not only are we talking about individuals that exploit young people, whether sexually or criminally, it's also about individuals that are involved in conflicts that exist within their geographical spaces, that upload their beefs and their conflicts for other young people to either get involved or for individuals to potentially partake in the behaviors ultimately that's out there. So a major issue that happens within the UK, and I'm sure many of you would understand, and especially it happens in America a lot as well, where young people will make a music video and they talk about the disrespect of another area code, another postcode, and those particular individuals that come from that area code will feel disrespected, will feel aggrieved on the basis of the things that has been said on the song that was projected by their enemies, their opposition. And then what happens, for example, in the UK, is that things happen then on Instagram and on YouTube. Conversations exist on those platforms, and then 24 hours later, there's a shooting in our community. There is a stabbing in our community, and young people lose their lives at such a rapid rate on the basis of social media platforms being used to air out their conflicts, their beefs, their issues between two different rival groups. So now we're in this particular space now where we as workers need to now push our understanding, our practice, not just in a physical sense, but now understanding the way in which social media works in order for us to have a counter narrative to engage with young people in that particular type of way. So when we talk about violence, just to bring it back to the point that when we talk about violence in context, even if we look at the island of Grenada, violence is not unique. And one of the things that I look at as a criminologist is as I look at global homicide rates, to kind of look at the murder rate per 100,000 people and what it looks like. And it's interesting because we look at places like El Salvador, Jamaica, Honduras, Belize, South Africa, Bahamas, Brazil, St. Lucia. And it's interesting when we start to look at the top 10 places of why they potentially can be so violent, linked to some of the root causes that I just previously mentioned. So when we look at Grenada in context, it ranks 40 in the world, if you didn't know, and that can change by the month. So when we're talking about individuals that potentially are impacted by issues of violence and homicide rates, Grenada ranks 40. But I argue that there's no coincidence. There's something that all of these countries have in common. And I want you to write down what you think that is. Going back just a couple of slides, write down on your notepads or pens or smartphones or whatever, what do you think all of these countries have in common? Because one of the things that we don't like to talk about is what I call the elephant in the room. One of the things that we don't like to talk about is the impact of racism, the impact of slavery, the impact of colonialism. Because one of the things that's really interesting is where you find the highest murder rates within society are the same lands where those resources have been robbed, peeled from individuals and left in a particular space where they're unable to pick up themselves and then are living on the basis of the fact that other nations have built their wealth off the back of individuals that come from these particular spaces, develop their wealth, their institutions, and then look at those countries and then say, you people are the most violent individuals within society. And one of the things that we don't often talk about is where did that violence ultimately come from? Because if we look at it through a historical context, all of these lands, which I've just mentioned, the nations, before colonialism and slavery, these places was not the most violent places on earth. So something happened. So when we talk about the impact of colonialism, we also have to talk about the intergenerational, not only trauma, but the sucking of economics and the changing of the way in which individuals have been mistreated and individuals that have entered into the diaspora from these particular places and the adverse impact it's had on those particular nations moving forward. So as a grandchild of grandparents that were from Jamaica and their parents were also from the Caribbean and their parents were once slaves at a particular point, I understand the impact of colonialism and how that's impacted even me within the UK. So when we talk about the system of racism, how that trickles down is that even though I'm on the road to becoming a doctor and having a PhD, I have to ensure that I'm the most educated in my field in order for people to recognize that Craig's just a nice guy to talk to, even here within the UK. And oftentimes we forget about the ripple effect of colonialism. But then when we look at those from the diaspora, when we talk about individuals that are from the lands, they're still having to pick up the pieces of the fact that those Western nations are still sucking the blood of those particular types of resources. And it's conversations we don't talk about. So yes, it may seem like, well, where's this got to do with the conversation about violence? But we have to start to look at the root cause of the problem. Problem is that we have is an arrogance, and I would say as a Western society, we have an arrogance. And that arrogance is that we mistreat people, we harm people, and then we blame the same people when there's issues happening within that the same society. And it's interesting because we do the same thing with young people. We create the environments for young people to misbehave. We create the environments for young people to find ways that they can mess around with the system. And then we blame young people for the violence. But young people are not the ones that bring cocaine into the country. Young people are not the ones that bring firearms into the country. Young people don't own any factories that make guns, that make cocaine, that make heroin. But yet still, all of these lands and the issues that cause the most problems are to do with drugs and firearms. So these are the conversations sometimes that we need to have moving forward. So when I talk about this idea, I think that it's important, and I think it's a moment in time where we can think. It's an opportunity for us to be visionaries. So with the information and the context in which we understand and the ripple effect of all of the things historically that have impacted on where we are right now, we have to start thinking about new ways that we're going to engage with children and young people, utilizing a public health approach to respond to violence. So for those of you that have never heard of a public health approach to engage in violence, we have to start to look at places like Chicago. What did Chicago do as a public health approach to engage with street violence? These are things that you're going to need to look up and research yourself. I'll say it again. What did Chicago do in using a public health approach to respond to issues of violence? What did Baltimore do? What did New York do? What did Scotland do in Europe to respond to issues of violence? Because when you then start to understand the public health approaches, you'll realize and recognize that the solutions that many of us and our governments that have been rolling out are going to be ineffective because we're not engaging with the root cause of the problem. And I'll give the analogy again. If we are engaging with children and young people, and we're only bringing them into a room and giving them very nice workshops about the issues and the consequences of crime, which is good, but if we think that's the only thing that's going to change their lives, then we're going backwards, because we need to start thinking about mental health. We need to start thinking about intergenerational trauma. We need to start thinking about what is the adverse impact of colonialism, the impact of those particular things, and how that is embedded in terms of the systems that are geared to supposed to engage with children and young people that may be affected by a range of different social ills. So one of the things that I think is just quick, is clear, and I want you to write these down. What exactly are we fighting? This is what Craig's saying. I am saying that we need to be engaging on responding to the fixed mindsets that are expressed by children and young people. We need to be fighting toxic masculinity and nihilistic narratives. So for those that don't know what nihilism is the thought process that ultimately anything is going to be destroyed. So the idea that a young person may say, I'm not going to make it till 18, I'm not going to make it to 20, I'm not going to make it till 21. So you know what? I'm going to get rich or die trying. Yeah, I'd rather get caught with my gun than get caught without it. I'd rather get caught with my cutlass, my machete, with or without it. So that particular mindset about destruction is because they have an internal belief that they're not going to make it anyway. It's what terrorists oftentimes have. They believe that they're not going to make it anyway, so destruction is the only thing to move forward. So saying it again, toxic masculinity and nihilistic narratives. We also are fighting systemic factors such as poverty, racism, resources, intergenerational trauma. This is my biggest one. Passion versus intellect amongst professionals. I know loads of brilliant, lovely individuals, lovely professionals, nice professionals. They say all of the nice things, but they don't know what they're talking about. systems that think short term and not long term. Going back to my original point, most of the approaches that are out there globally around responding to issues related to young people, it's always a short term fix. So here within the UK, we have this kind of mindset of April to April during the tax year. So loads of money comes in May, where we have loads of money to do loads of activities with young people. But up until April, we have to spend all the money and to do all of these brilliant activities with the hope that we might get the money back again the following year, or we might not get it at all. And that mindset creates an independency from community organizations that kind of roll on, roll off about funding, but don't really think about the long-term factors and ideas of how we engage with young people. So this is what I want you to be visionaries for. And I'm going to give you all an idea. So this is an approach that's been adapted by academic, social scientists, professionals within the context of Chicago, because I like the Chicago's model of responding to violence. And this is what I brought to the Caribbean in Jamaica, and also gave them a similar idea. So what I suggest for those that are serious as a collective, we're talking about social organization here, is that we need to make a call for what I call a violence desistance and a diaspora forum. And what that idea is we are calling for professionals within the Caribbean, amongst the Caribbean, those that find themselves amongst the diaspora, that we come together as one entity with a thought process. And why it's realistic, because I'm part of what is called the EU Gangs Network. And the EU Gang Network meet once a year or 2 times a year for about a week, where you have the top academics in sociology, criminology, that write specifically and do research around gangs, all of the top frontline professionals around the world that do stuff around gangs. And we meet for a week, 1 time throughout the year, to discuss, to create, to develop things that we as an entity can bounce off the experiences of individuals in one particular room to create something and move forward. So as a violent desistance and diaspora forum, what that means is those family members from Grenada, those family members from Trinidad and Tobago, those family members from the Bahamas, those family members from St. Kitts and other places, we come together and we have a tailored agenda about what it is what we're going to do. And I tell you why. Because the experiences of children that come from the diaspora here in the UK are very similar to our family members that are where you are right now. So when you have our children that have an identity crisis because they don't know what village they come from, they don't know who their people are, they don't know their identity and their connections to culture and so on and so forth, and they grow up in a society that is totally alien to them and totally alien to their needs, and also is a system that creates them, that is created to fail them, we need to start sharing our mindsets and our experiences across the waters. So I'm going to break down to you now what it would look like and what it ultimately would do. So the Violent Desistance and Diaspora Forum, and sorry, just to, for those that have never heard the word desistance, all desistance means is the process of which causes criminality to stop. Sometimes I say words and I also just want to make sure that people know what I'm talking about. So again, desistance means the process in order for criminality to stop. So the Violence, Desistance and Diaspora Forum would consist of leading academics and professionals in the field of gangs or serious youth violence. And when I say serious youth violence, that doesn't necessarily mean young people are in gangs. It also can mean that there's young people that are involved in issues around guns, issues around prostitution, extortion, any other form of violence, which also includes terrorism, whether that is to do with religion or whether that's to do with another form of ideology. So all of those individuals, key individuals, are in ultimately one room. And these would then be the primary objectives. So number one, to build, and this is the important, again, socially organized, to build a foundation of knowledge regarding the socio-economic conditions and institutional processes that foster or curtail to social exclusion and subsequent emergence of persistence of youth gangs. So what that's ultimately saying is that I want to know from what's going on for you, what are the social economic conditions for young people in Grenada, in St. Lucia? And then I can tell you about the area that I'm from, where there's so much gun violence. Are there any the connections in terms of the behaviors, the thought processes, the ideas of young people that live in those spaces? To then construct an infrastructure of comparative, multi-method, cross-national research on youth violence in group context. So what that means then is that we need to join up our thinking and our ideas, because then we can create a method that if that works for you there, it may work for the young people here. Why? Because if we're talking about, for example, intergenerational trauma, I know that through my family, that intergenerational trauma, none of my family have been through therapy. So I know that I'm gonna have a certain mindset that may be linked to a mindset of a young person that's from Grenada. Then we need to disseminate and effectively utilize our knowledge to inform the development of effective local, national, and international responses to emerging issues around youth crime and violence. So then we bring our family, our friends, our partners, those that are tasked to want to work on the agenda, whether that's education, whether that's religious institutions, whether that's healthcare institutions, whether that's independent educational institutions that seek to want to respond to the issues, and we come together ultimately as a collective. That's what the forum ultimately does. Sharing of ideas, coming together with ideas, coming up with methods and approaches that only suit our needs. That only suit our needs. Because if I was working with an organization within the UK that was dealing with young women that were victims or survivors of domestic violence, I couldn't come in and talk about, as a man, I need to be thinking about doing things, or they need to be thinking about doing things from a male perspective. They would tell me, shut my mouth, and this is how they need to do it, because the methods and the approaches that they would use are to suit the issues and the needs of women. So in this particular context, when we're talking about violence across the diaspora, it's also talking about methods and approaches that specifically function and cater to our needs. So as a visual, this is what it would look like. And again, I want you to take a picture again. And I don't mind if you teeth it, you can have it. So similar to the Eurogang network, this is what I've adapted and said that I think this would work. And this is something that we do locally here within the West Midlands. And I believe that if we kind of follow this methodology in different parts of the world and stuck to it, we could have some sort of effective ideas that come around reducing some of the issues that our children are faced with. So you see the first section, which says key stakeholders. Question is, who are the key stakeholders? Key stakeholders are individuals. Going back to my previous point, these will be leading academics and professionals in the field of gang serious youth violence in all forms. So it's not going to be individuals that are just from the community that just want to help. It's going to be leading people in their areas, in their fields. So, for example, in my local area, Birmingham City University has a research center that deals with violence. I'm a part of that. Some of my mentors that I've wrote many books behind me are a part of that. And then you connect with those that are really doing the work in your local community. And those are the individuals that get invited to be part of those key stakeholders. You also may have individuals from schools. You may have individuals from religious institutions. You may have individuals that may be from health organizations, mental health services that are well known in their local community to be doing the right thing and really doing what they say that they do. Now, these are the key stakeholders. So these are ultimately the umbrella. From the key stakeholders, these individuals would develop what is called a community of practice. So the role of a community of practice is to just respond. The role of the community of practice is to respond to issues that may be affecting the community at that particular time. So I'll give you an example. So the community of practice that we've developed in the West Midlands, for example, as I just said earlier on, that there's been a number of shootings in my local area where I live. So the community of practice's role would be to work with the key stakeholders to think about what is going to be an adequate and realistic response in the moment. So I'm due to have a meeting next week about the potential tit-for-tat shootings that are going to continue in my local area. So someone may make the decision that, you know what, we need to get parents in the local community into one room and have a discussion, whether that's via Zoom, whether that's via Teams, whether that's via Skype, whether that's via Instagram. We need to find a way to communicate with parents that may be involved. Another example, the community of practice may say, you know what, it's not about the parents. We need to get the gang members talking because we need a solution, we need a resolution, we need to mediate. So the community of practice, guided by the key stakeholders, would then connect with individuals that are on the ground to connect from one area to another area to ensure that there's a conversation taking place. So it might mean that the reason why these lot are shooting after these individuals is because a party happened 3 weeks ago and a young female got shot that happened to be a cousin, a sister of a well-known gang member or someone that's well-known on one side. So the mediation becomes important through the key stakeholders and community of practice because they are the ones that are going to engage. But then you need research teams. And your research teams are either individuals at your local colleges or your universities that ultimately guide the thinking and the processes. So at the beginning, you heard Debbie say that, you know, myself and others work in conjunction with the National Youth Agency. So what we do at the National Youth Agency is we collect ideas and research and up-to-date methods and issues relating to children and young people and put that in a format that individuals can understand. And then we give that to individuals that are frontline workers to then roll that out in their local communities. Now, with this particular image, as I've just said, this can be adapted to make it more simple for you. However, we need to have individuals that are informing your practice. Research is important because the research enables you to stay up to date with what's going on. As I said, social media changes so rapidly. For example, in COVID-19, a platform that's been around for a little while, but was used even more so in COVID-19, known as House Party. I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with House Party, but House Party in the context of what was going on here in the UK is that young people were utilizing the House Party to argue with each other and also brandish firearms. And as a consequence of those discussions on House Party, there was a number of shootings that took place in our local community. So you can look at these particular models and you can adapt that according to what makes better sense for you. But just don't forget the fact that you're going to need someone that's informing your practice. Because when we look at it from a youth work perspective, history tells us that youth work has always been an art form, a philosophy, a methodology, an approach that has always helped in any society, individuals that have engaged with young people. Why? Because youth workers are spontaneous. Youth workers are informal educators. Oftentimes we're not guided by the state, by the government. Oftentimes we think of creative ways to engage with young people in the moment when we engage with issues that they may be faced with. Youth workers are versatile in the way that they engage with different types of people. Going back to my previous point about the person-centered approach, we recognize that engaging with different people is going to require different types of skills. So whereas one individual or family or member of the community may need mediation, another family may not need mediation at that particular moment. Conflict resolution is good. Restorative justice is very good. But depending on the situation, circumstance, and the individuals that you're engaging with may not be appropriate at that time. So, for example, when I was working in Jamaica, for example, many of them were taught how to do models and interventions around conflict resolution. Some of them were only told about models of restorative justice. So when I was working with a lot of the professionals out there, they were saying that they've come to a brick wall, because when they're engaging with some of the families, they're saying they don't want restorative justice. And I said, well, of course, because if somebody's been shot or stabbed and I'm aggrieved or I'm angry about that, restorative justice at that particular moment is not the best methodology. However, it's a methodology that can be used much later, because what you need is an individual that listens. What you need is an individual that's going to give some presence. What you're going to need is an individual that's actually going to be empathetic and sympathetic to the situation that you're being faced with. So when you only give people one particular approach or method to engage with people in a time of crisis, that's why these things are always very difficult. So I'm saying it again, the idea about using holistic approaches, recognizing that conversation and what comes out of our mouths are our most powerful tool. So when we have conversations about working with individuals that are victims and issues of violence, we have to be realistic. We can't create things that are far from our reach, that we're unable to deliver, to provide. So as I say to young people sometimes, that listen, we might not have no money right now, but we're still able to work. And I don't engage with young people based on no promises. However, when you look at places like Baltimore, they didn't have loads of funding, but was able to reduce violence within their particular areas. Why? Because they were organized. They adopted models guided by research that everybody understood and was able to tailor that to their needs and engage with young people in those particular communities. And I think moving forward, one of the key conversations I think that we need to push forward in terms of our experiences, in terms of our historical experiences and the things that we've experienced as a diaspora across the world, is we need to start engaging in programs around intergenerational trauma, because we need that process of healing. And it also starts with self. So many of us that are committed to engaging this issue around violence, it's important that we also acknowledge and understand that sometimes we need to go through a therapeutic process in order for us to arrive at a particular type of space. So this is the end of the webinar. This webinar from my perspective, that is, in terms of what I'm going to deliver as information. I want to open up the door now for my people to talk to me. I know that there's probably a few burning questions. There's probably a few things that people want to ask me, or there may be a series of concepts that I've said that people want me to quickly explain, which I'm happy to. I'm also expecting and hoping that people, based on some of the things that I just said, will extend your experiences and tell me about some of the things that I've discussed, and also some of the challenges that you may have been faced. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to allow Debbie in first to ask me some questions, and then we'll go from there, if that's cool.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Is that fine?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Craig. And every time I listen to your webinar, I pick up a different sort of theme and a different thread, a different narrative every time. So it's very interesting, and certainly from a youth work practitioner perspective, it gets you to think more and reflect more about what we do as youth workers and the importance of working alongside alongside young people. One of the questions that I think what I wanted to ask was, could you just go back to your slide that talked about, I think you said you're going to talk about a bit more somewhere about this, the school to prison. And I'm just wondering, you posed a question that said, how do we know what young people need? And do we ever really know that? And I think I'd really like our colleagues to come in to say about how do they get those conversations, perhaps with some of those young people who are so displaced from society as such through no fault of their own? How do we engage back with them? And I just want to maybe you to talk through some of your experiences.
I think from my experience, I always say that young people are always going to be our best teachers. So as an adult and an adult that's aging, I'm still 18, right? I'm still 18.
Absolutely.
Everybody below 18. All right. So as an adult that's continuously obviously aging, I rely a lot on young people to tell me about their experiences. So I do not ever enter into a project or a program about young people without including young people into that. Now, some of us may say, well, I don't really have access to young people like that. Well, I'm sure that you have a connection to a neighbor that has children. I'm sure that you have nieces and nephews and little brothers and sisters. And listen, when I want to know stuff about technology, half of these slides that I've been using that seem like they're flashing is because of young people that have shown me how to do it. So young people are our biggest teachers. So we have to communicate better with young people and not just with adults. Too many times we sit around tables talking about young people, but not bringing young people to the table. And I think it's important that we set up spaces as well as forums for young people to tell us what they would like and also to hold us accountable for the things that we say, because we don't always get it right as adults.
I think that's a really good point. The other question what is going to be posed is around, you talked about different genders as well, especially in terms of from the gang culture, Craig. And I know certainly from where I live up in the north of England, there's still a perception that young women are coerced into gangs or obviously are abused into it. But there's not a real lot of discussion about actually sometimes young women not necessarily choose, but actually are some of those gang leaders. And I think there's still a society assumption that girls or young women can't be those leaders of gangs, and there's always kind of like a victim side to it. And I'm just wondering, has that ever been explored?
I think the problem with that situation, Debbie, is because the literature that's available to us generally come from organizations that only specifically work with young women that have been either coerced or exploited sexually.
Right, that's interesting.
So for example, in the UK, we have things like Women's Aid.
Yeah.
So they've done a lot of reports about young women in gangs and so on and so forth. But as a gang researcher, I haven't found those experiences amongst the young men that I've worked with. Rather, what I have found is that there's interpersonal issues that happen within gangs. So for example, a young woman goes out with one of the main guys that's in the group. There's a relationship breakdown, and then that woman then goes off. And then because they're labeled as a gang, automatically it's seen as that woman was somehow coerced. But if you take away the labels, these are just basic relationships.
Yes.
That individuals are happening with each other. However, I will also say that there are scenarios and examples where girls do get sexually exploited, but there's not enough data that gives us that indication to say that in order for a woman to be amongst a group, she has to give herself sexually in order to be part of the group. In fact, there's a lot of women that actually play significant roles within gangs, because we're talking about, again, girlfriends, we're talking about wives, we're talking about sisters, siblings. We don't even think about the concept of the role of a sister, the role of a cousin that may be involved in gangs because their older cousin or their sibling is as a high ranking status within that gang. But then there's also the difference between street gangs and organized criminals. Because when you look at organized criminality, for example, when you look at mafias, for example, like in the UK, we have the Turkish mafia, we have the Albanian mafia, you got Polish mafias, for example, or the Chinese triads. And women actually play a very powerful role because they're seen as the mothers, the upkeepers, the individuals that provide. So men look at those individuals actually as a significant role. And I think that the literature that always puts women in a submissive state is part of the problem. And I think that women play a significant role.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think that's just a couple of questions that came out of some of those discussions. I'd really like it if people could unmute and please ask Craig any questions or what any of your thoughts on the presentation this morning. Come on, I know you're dying to.
What would be nice is, I'm sure everybody can see Is there not like a reaction button?
Yes, they can. They can put a at the bottom. I think there's
Yeah,
reaction buttons.
I
Yeah.
would like to hear someone's voice. I feel like I'm at a family party and everybody just sitting around the table and not talking.
Okay, hi Craig.
That's Lisa.
Can
Hello everyone. Good morning.
just introduce yourself before you
I'm
question?
sitting here, Craig. I want to say kudos to you. A well presented presentation.
Thank you.
Oh, Lisa, I said Lisa. Yes, I'm saying kudos to you. The presentation was very informative, very solid. You were quite knowledgeable on the content and so on. But I just want to add a little bit as it relates to the interaction. But you said that, you know, you have to get young persons involved.
Yes.
And a lot of times we have, as you said, the stakeholders are the ones who would actually meet. They would be the one who does the strategic plan, not even, you know, and it happens in Grenada too, from my experience, not even, I mean, thinking of the young people to give their contributions, you know, and I was reading some time ago that as it relates to human relation, the main objective of it is meeting the needs of any individual or any person. And I mean, to meet needs of the person, you must know what is the issue the person is having, analyze it, and then move on from there. So basically, I am also adding my voice to say that we need to do a paradigm shift. We need to actually get the young persons involved. I'm a school attendant officer.
Yes.
And I deal with parents, we deal with students. Some of the students who don't come to school, it's not that they don't want to, but there are a lot of online issues. And if you don't actually get the students to talk or the persons to talk why you don't want to come to school, then we see them as rebellious. We see them as being disobedient. But in truth and in fact, from listening to a lot of them, just a little chit chat, and you would actually understand the issues students are dealing with, and then we can definitely move on. So I just wanted to join my voice with that little.
Totally agree, mate. And thank you. I love hearing my people's voices from across the waters. Anybody else want to chat to me?
No. Sure, Craig. Hi, morning.
Morning.
It's Freya, also from Grenada.
Hey, Freya.
I really love your presentation, and to be honest, I actually get goosebumps when you talk about colonialism, because that is one of the biggest factors that's been plaguing us, not only in Grenada, but in the Caribbean, because you see that they came, they took, and they left. And it leave us in this, I would say, dark area, because even as you grow, or even as other generations come about, it's the same thing. It's like our parents pass on, and that is what we've seen. It's like we never really moved on. We never really moved on from this part. And I've been to UK. I've been to Birmingham, nice city.
Hey.
I've been to, well, mostly my family are based in Bristol.
Okay, I got family in Bristol too.
Yes,
and
but
Bristol's very, very historic in terms of
very historic.
as it relates to colonialism too.
That is true. And my other half of the family originated from Scotland.
Okay.
Right. So they're interracial marriage, whichever. And I remember one day that my cousin came home from school and she was crying, and I was like, you know, what up? And she was like, oh, she's been bullied and stuff, and they're calling her black, and she doesn't even look like, if you look at her, she doesn't even look like she have an ounce of black in her.
Yes.
You know, and I was like, why? And she was like, oh, that's so. I said, you know what? I said, tomorrow I'm gonna come meet you from school. So then I went to the school evening, wait for her, and then this group of girls like just starts, and they're like, oh yeah, and you bring your nigger cousin, and then the thing is, what I was saying is that here in Grenada, we might say something to each other and we think that's racism. That is not racism. When you travel and you hear the stuff that bullying you for like no reason, standing in a line of Tesco and they like move nigga.
Freya, we've just lost your volume. I think our internet might have just gone.
And I got food poisoning. You know what kind of scary because the mentality that we have from the Caribbean, people in Scotland are very, very, very sick. So I remember I got food poisoning and then the doctor pulled out this needle to give me an injection and I was like, oh my God, like being the kind of person I am, I asked myself, is that the injection needle that you use on black people? And he was like, oh, so then he pulled out this bigger one and he's like, oh yeah, and I use this one on white. And he just started laughing and then he made me feel comfortable, you know, with him. But the thing is, I'm really, really glad that you touched on this point in reference to colonization because that is basically one of our big issues and we really need to talk about that. And I really enjoyed the presentation today and have a great day, guys.
Thank you. Have an amazing morning.
Hi, Craig. This is Tonisha. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask,
Yeah.
how do we include persons with lived experiences of crime and violence in the process of youth violence in the process of helping address the issue?
Excellent question. I in terms of the work that we do here in the UK, so one of the things that I do is I actually train individuals that have come out of prison, individuals that have done, I prefer to work with young men that have done some sort of violent type of crime, only because it's the type of young people that I work with. And I believe that individuals with lived experiences actually play a vital role in engaging with young people. However, when you look at the, I think Debbie will send some of the links, but I wrote an article for the NYA called Responding to Youth Violence Through Youth Work. And one of the key arguments that I was posing is that individuals with lived experience have an essential role. However, we cannot overlook the fact that individuals need to be trained. So it's not about individuals just having lived experiences, but it's also the acknowledgement that they need to develop the skills and the knowledge to be able to engage with children and young people, because this is what generally happens. An individual comes out of prison, they say they want to work with young people for whatever reason, and say, oh yeah, back in the day, I was this and I was that, which is good to some young people, but to some young people, they're like, so what? I don't care where you come from and what back in the day was. So they're only limited because of their story. So where youth work training is important is that it will teach those individuals with lived experiences the holistic learning, the democratic and inclusive practice, the informal education, the spontaneous learning, the creativity that comes with that, the negotiation, the interpersonal communication skills, emotional intelligence. So then it enables that individual with the lived experience and the youth work training to come together, and goes back to my original point that I said in the beginning, bridging the gap between academia and the streets. And that's what I'm all about. So it's not just about having all of the youth work qualifications and you don't engage with young people. And it's not just all about having lived experiences without education. It needs to come together. And those effective workers, regardless of where they are around the world, will all tell you they've either had lived experiences and have gone through a process of learning and change, and they've put that together in order to be an effective practitioner. So it's ideal and vital that we need those individuals to be able to connect in our communities. And in a public health approach, when you've seen the model that I showed you about engaging, and you've seen me put frontline professionals as well as community practice, they will become essential, because I gave you a scenario where there may have been a shooting and we need individuals to mediate between both parties. I believe that those types of individuals are the best individuals to mediate, because they're going to know the mandem, they're going to know the gangs, they're going to know everybody that's a part of those ends. And we would utilize those individuals to break down some of those boundaries in order for discussion to take place.
Am I okay just to pick up on a little bit on something on that as well, like you said, Craig, if that's okay? I'm doing a comparative study up in the north of England,
Yes.
and very much working alongside individuals with lived experiences, both from obviously who those have obviously just come out of prison, and also around mental health, but also around substance misuse. And there's a real strong feel now certainly across the UK, about really involving people with lived experiences. But I think what got lost in all that was very much what Craig says but it's about investing in them to support them, so that those people with lived experiences actually do have the support through training, so that we don't put them into vulnerable positions again, so that we're not making the same mistakes when we're solely concentrating on how we can support young people or how we can support their peers. But actually, what do we do as a society to ensure that we support them? And I think, Craig, you picked up on it really interesting, was in that we actually not only recognise, but we also acknowledge the journey that they have been on, and that does not have to be an academic journey at all. That's about how we learn from that. So I just wanted to put that in, because we're having similar sort of discussions with older people with lived experiences, peer mentoring, fellow people who of a similar age. So it's just interesting.
Somebody just had their hand up. I think you've just.
Somebody else.
So hey, how you doing? You okay?
Hi, Sandina Neely here from the Bahamas.
Hey.
Just
how you
want to
doing?
say a huge thank you to Dr. Amina, to Sita, to Deborah, and everyone from the NYA for allowing us to participate in this training all these weeks. It has been a phenomenal experience. And the ending with Craig, the final session, was absolutely amazing. As a social scientist myself, it has been just the greatest presentation, and we appreciate that. And so, Craig, I have a question on
Yeah.
the Violence, Desistance, and Diaspora Forum. Is that something that is currently in the works?
No.
Is there any more information that you have on that?
No, it is an idea that I'm posing, which is kind of an idea and a call to action. So I would be more than happy to have that conversation with my colleagues. What I'm trying to do is try and get Honor to invite me, because I want some sunshine. I'm fed up of the cold. I want to come over this, and I will happily sit on the beach with a nice juice, with my feet in the water, with one of you giving me the breakdown of what that mother would look like. So yes, if anybody's there and they've got a spare bedroom and they've got water, they've got fruits, and they've got some nice food, I'm happy to roll. But it's an idea. It's ultimately an idea that I'm putting out to those from the diaspora, that those of us in the diaspora here, and we understand that our experiences are not separate from the experiences of those that are from our homelands. And it's about how do we connect those dots. And if it just means that, even if it's a conversation of us moving forward of what that looks like, even just in a local or regional context, then we can actually do it in a wider context. Because if, as I said, if I'm part of the forum...
We're happy to have the conversation. We're happy to have the conversation. I see that Grenada is saying that you should come. The Bahamas is saying the same as well.
So, Debbie, I think that we're going to be on the flight going somewhere.
Well, I think that, you know, you just need me there just for the chat. So yeah, absolutely.
We're on board as well from the Commonwealth.
Fabulous, yeah. I think you'll have a posse of people coming across. Nicole has just asked a question. Nicole, if you're happy for me to ask that for you, what advice would you give to a female youth worker who supervises a male-centred programme to help deal with their various social issues? That's a really good question, Nicole, and something that I came across in my earlier days working as a youth and community and drugs worker, working with prolific offenders. So it'll be interesting. Some of the narratives that Craig has had with some female workers. And
Yes,
thank you for...
my advice would be, and I would point back to the article that we wrote on responding to youth violence through youth work. So one of the things that I talk about is an approach that I've adopted called on-road youth work, working with young people and meeting their needs using a person-centered approach. Now, one of the things I talk about is gender, and it's about acknowledging the gender roles amongst the individuals that we work with. So you heard me in the presentation mention and gave you an analogy that I, as a male, wouldn't walk into an institution or an environment where women are victims or survivors of some sort of sexual exploitation or domestic violence, because I understand that my masculine entity in that moment may not be the most appropriate at that time. So there's going to be ideas and factors where you may have an organization, you may have a program where you're engaging with predominantly the opposite sex, which is fine, but it's the acknowledgement and recognizing as a worker, which is all now about self-reflection, which is also about emotional intelligence, which is also about the idea about a person-centered approach, to recognize that for some of the interventions, it's not going to require a woman or it's not going to require a man. And we have to be humble to that. So when I work with, for example, some violent young men, guess what I do? I bring women with me, especially in a prison context. And you know why? Because when I walk onto a wing and there's individuals within the prison context, I understand what hypermasculinity is. So when an individual sees me, and because I'd like to think that I'm big and I've got muscles, they see me as a threat. I'm not a threat, but they perceive me as a threat. So the moment I walk onto the wing, the first thing they start talking about is, who does he think he is? Who is my man walking around like this and that? But I'm not actually a threat. But the reason why I might be a threat is because I may reflect the individual that punched their mum in the face. I may reflect the individual that said they was going to take them out to the shops and never came back. I may represent the individual that said that they loved them but harmed them every single day. So whilst I acknowledge that as a male working with hypermasculine men, I would bring a woman with me, because a woman in that context represents girlfriend, mum, auntie, sister. So to lessen the anxiety and the tension, I bring those women in to use the conversations in, and then I do my approach. So you have to be very skilled because the context is going to be very different. I'd love to have a conversation with you more about the context, but the point I'm making with my example is that example what I gave is because I'm working in an environment where all of the men are just walking around and they're all at 10. So I need you to come down to 7 to hear me. I need you to come down to 7.5 to 6.5 just to hear what it is that I've got to say. And if I have to be skillful in my approaches with workers that are male or female, then I'll do that. And on the flip side, it may be women. So I understand that just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're going to be able to work with women. Because I'm a man doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to work with men. I may be able to work with some men, but I'm understanding of those different complexities that may exist with different people. So one word I want you to think about is called reflexivity. So one of the words we always get taught in social science is reflection, and we need to do loads of reflection. But one of the things that we don't get oftentimes told to do is reflexivity. And what reflexivity is all about is acknowledging the incident, the issue at hand, but also recognizing your role within that in the moment. And that's what makes an effective worker. And going back to the previous question about individuals with lived experiences, they're the type of skills that we need them to have. So recognizing just because you was someone that once bust your gun 10 years ago, in 2020, these young people don't care. And if you don't acknowledge that they don't care, you're going to go in there with this tokenistic ideal that because you're a man and you're a woman and you've had the experience, that's enough to get that young person from A to B. And actually, you're actually failing a young person 10 times more than actually the idea that you ultimately have. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Craig. We're just coming. I'm just thinking, is there anything else before anybody else want to ask one last?
I want to hear one more voice. Come on, then. I got 5 more minutes. Come on, one more voice.
Hi,
I want to hear one more voice.
Hi, how are you? I'm Kelly Broadway. I'm from the Bahamas.
Hey.
And one of the things that I really appreciate in this seminar was the intergenerational trauma. I was a welfare officer for 11 years, and I've been a youth officer for now 2 years. And one of the things that I noticed here in the Bahamas is that when we tend to make youth programs just geared to youth. However, I don't know if that is the same in other places, but here I noticed that the ages of grandparents and parents have also gone down drastically. So they're still considered as youth.
Yes.
And in order to deal with the trauma that our actual youth, in quotes, are dealing with, I think we need to deal with the parent as well as the grandparent in some issues in order to really ratify the issue. Because we tend to forget that when we put them in our safe haven, where they feel safe, we create these areas, but when they leave there, they have to go back to the environments that facilitated the issues that they now have that we are dealing with. And in order for us to really get rid of the problem or assist them with their problem, they need to see that one, we hear them, and two, that we're actually listening, not just hearing, so that we're trying to extend our hand and our reach, not just to them, but to actually deal with the underlying issue in terms of, instead of putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound,
yes,
we actually get the stitches, take the bullet out and stitch it up. So I really enjoyed that.
And I would just conclude with, I'm in total agreement about that. But one of the things I think, which one of the sisters just previously said, is that we need a paradigm and a radical shift also in our education system. So it also means that we need to possibly decolonize our educational system. Because when we talk about therapy, welfare, youth work, oftentimes the methods and approaches and ideas come from Eurocentric thinkers.
Right.
So when we talk about a welfare or mental health perspective, it's not adaptive to our needs. Think about it, oftentimes when people get sent to universities, despite where the university is, the literature comes from Germany, the literature comes from the UK, the literature comes from America. Now, if I'm from the diaspora talking about intergenerational trauma, I'm sorry, but the frameworks that's oftentimes used within a European context is not going to entertain me. Because if I say that I'm a victim of racism, where in your framework does that understand what I'm talking about when I say they're looking at me funny? When I say I feel an awkwardness when I walk into the room? So what we need to then think about is African-centered approaches that are tailored towards our needs. So then we then start to look at individuals that are professors and social scientists within our realm. Because within education, and when I used to work at the university, one of my tasks is to ensure that there was a multidisciplinary perspective on criminology and sociology. So I made sure that we had individuals like W.E. Du Bois's ideas and concepts like double consciousness, individuals such as Dr. Frances Cress Welsing that speaks about ideas about white supremacy and what racism is, and not from the context of the Oxford Dictionary, which only talks about prejudice. We introduced the teachings of people like Frederick Douglass, Malcolm X, and a whole host of individuals that we can look at. So we're talking about the same thing, but with a lens in which we're in touch with. And that's what I mean by the forum, that it enables us of academics and professionals to say, wait there, this is a worldview that we understand from the diaspora. And actually, this is the type of methodology, if we're talking about mental health, welfare, engaging in intergenerational trauma through healing processes, this is what's ultimately going to work better for us.
Right. I know in my bachelor's studies, I knew how I felt. But until I did an African studies course, it kind of aligned how I felt with now why I felt that way. And a lot of us don't have that knowledge because, like you said, we learn European, British, all these different things, but we don't learn about ourselves. I mean, in terms of Black selves. So it's once I went through that course, I started saying, wow, okay, so now I understand why my cousin is the way he is, or because our fathers have been yucked from our home from we were there in order to break us down, to make sure that we remained submissive, I guess. And the whole imprisonment, and it just opened my eyes, and we don't have that. And maybe we need to, like you say, put that into our educational system. And it's weird because we're Caribbean, we're predominantly Black, we still don't learn about African history and our real history. We still learn about Christopher Columbus discovering the West Indies. And different things. So maybe if they had a sense of who they really are, that would break down a lot of the confusion and them trying to be or trying to fix or fill a void that's present. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I just want to extend my thank you to everybody that attended this webinar. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I feel like I'm at a christening or a wedding with all my family around the table, and we're just chatting about life and things. So I thank you all for your participation. I thank you all for your comments, your expressions, your experiences. I've learned a lot also as well. And thank you, Debbie, for hosting today. And we'll call that to an end. Let's stay in touch via social media and whatever, and just keep doing what you're doing, because you've also got to bear in mind that there's not many of us around the world that actually have the heart and the courage to do the work that you're doing. And despite our challenges, despite the issues that we're ultimately faced with, we are what I call the last superheroes, because youth workers and youth work practitioners and educators are always the ones that are prepared to stick their neck on the line, despite the fact of the challenges that we have. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your morning and the rest of your day. I know it's probably hot where you are. It's okay, the weather over here, so I'm not too vexed today.
It's gorgeous up here.
Other than that, thank you, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Can I just mention to everybody as well, there's a link for the evaluation form. I'd really appreciate if you could just take 5 minutes of your time just to fill the evaluation form in. That certainly helps us, NYA and Craig, and also the Commonwealth as well. So just really appreciate 5 minutes of your time. And can I just reiterate what Craig said? Thank you so much for this morning. It's been an absolute pleasure to be part of the webinar. And thanks to Stephen in the background somewhere, who's been helping people come in and out of the chat. Thank you, Craig.